The house on Willow Lane stood still, pristine, and inviting once again. The new family who moved in, a couple, John and Emily, with their young daughter Lily, seemed to have adjusted well. On the surface, everything looked perfect. The house was spacious, with freshly painted walls and brand new furnishings. But even in the calm of their new beginning, a shadow loomed. John was the first to notice the oddities. The first night, he swore he heard faint whispers. He dismissed it, thinking it was just the house settling. But by the second night, those whispers had grown louder. By the third, Lily had begun talking to someone who wasn't there. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Emily asked, watching as Lily sat on the floor, her dolls lined up in a circle. "The lady," Lily replied matter-of-factly. Emily froze. "What lady?" "The lady who lives here." She said her name is Claire. The mention of the name sent a chill down Emily's spine. She had done her research before moving in. There had been a fire years ago, and though no one knew exactly what happened, there had been rumors about the family that once lived there, and about a young woman named Claire. John tried to dismiss the stories as children's imaginations running wild, but as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore. Doors began to creak open on their own. The temperature in the house would drop inexplicably. Objects moved, and always there were the whispers. It wasn't long before John and Emily discovered the history of the house. One evening, after another sleepless night, filled with strange sounds and ghostly footsteps, John found himself in the basement. He had heard a low, rhythmic thudding, and curiosity got the better of him. There, tucked away in the far corner of the basement, was the trapdoor, the same trapdoor Claire had discovered. John pulled it open, revealing the dark staircase that led into the depths of the house's true horror. Emily heard John's shout and rushed down to find him standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the altar. The symbols on the floor were no longer glowing, but the presence of something malevolent still lingered. On the altar lay the same book, its pages open to a passage written in a language neither of them could understand. But they didn't need to understand it to feel the weight of the curse. John felt it in his bones. This house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. That night, as John and Emily tried to figure out what to do, Lily's behavior grew stranger. She began speaking in her sleep, whispering phrases they couldn't comprehend, and then just before midnight, she woke suddenly, her eyes wide and staring straight ahead. "She's coming," Lily said in a voice that wasn't her own. Emily ran to her side, but Lily's eyes remained unfocused. "Who's coming, baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The woman in the fire," Lily murmured. "She says it's not over." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Claire. The name lingered in her mind. They needed to know more. Desperation drove her back into the basement the next day, determined to find out what Claire's connection to the house was. As Emily pored over old town records and newspaper clippings, she uncovered the full story. Claire had sacrificed herself to end the curse. But it hadn't been enough. The house had found a way to rebuild itself, drawing new families into its web of darkness. Claire's spirit had become part of the house, forever bound to its walls. But Claire wasn't the only presence. Something darker had been awakened, a force older than the house, feeding off the fear of those who lived there. The house wanted more. It wasn't just a home, it was a trap. One night, John was jolted awake by a sound that made his skin crawl. A soft, almost inaudible voice, like a whisper on the wind, was calling his name. He glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m. Emily lay beside him, still fast asleep. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, like the pressure had changed. And that voice, it wasn't stopping. Slowly, cautiously, John got out of bed. He followed the voice, which seemed to be coming from the hallway outside their room. As he opened the door, a rush of cold air hit him. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb at the far end. But the voice was clearer now. "Help me." It was Claire. Her voice was soft, desperate. John followed the voice into the living room, where the temperature had dropped even more. His breath came out in white puffs as he looked around. And then, in the corner of the room, he saw her. Claire stood there, her figure barely visible in the shadows, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her mouth opened, but instead of words, a cold gust of wind swept through the room. The lights flickered once, then went out. When they flicked back on, she was gone. Terrified, John and Emily knew they couldn't stay in the house any longer. But something, or someone, wouldn't let them leave. Every time they tried to pack their things, something would stop them. The car wouldn't start. The doors would jam. The air around them would feel heavy, as if an unseen force was pressing down on them. Desperate, they went back into the basement. The trapdoor, once again, called to them. But this time, when they descended, the chamber was different. The symbols on the floor were glowing faintly again, and the air buzzed with energy. Claire's voice echoed in the room. "You have to finish it," she whispered. Emily was shaking. "Finish what?" "The ritual," Claire's voice echoed, growing louder. It wasn't complete. John approached the altar. The book lay open once more, but now the words seemed to shift and move on the page. And then they saw it. The final step in the ritual. Claire had sacrificed herself. But there was still one more act required to break the curse fully. One more life. John and Emily stared at the book in horror. The final step was clear. It demanded a soul. But who? Claire was already lost to the house. They couldn't bear the thought of sacrificing their daughter. But the curse wouldn't end without the final act. Suddenly, Lily's voice came from behind them. "It's okay, Mommy," she said, her small hand gripping Emily's. "The lady said it has to be me." Emily's heart shattered. "No, baby, no," she sobbed, pulling Lily into her arms. But Lily's face remained calm, as if she understood something that they didn't. She said, "I can stop it. I'm not scared." Before John or Emily could react, the room began to shake. The symbols on the floor blazed with light, the walls vibrating with a deafening hum. The house was demanding the sacrifice. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she held her daughter tight, her mind racing for a way out. But there was none. The house wouldn't let them go. Lily's voice cut through the chaos. "I'm ready." As the room exploded with energy, Lily stepped toward the altar, and then, with a blinding flash of light, everything went silent. The house on Willow Lane stood empty for years after that night. Neighbors whispered about the strange family who had disappeared without a trace, leaving all their belongings behind. Some said the house was cursed, that no one should ever live there. But one day, a new family arrived. They had heard the stories, but they didn't believe in ghosts or curses. As they unpacked their things, a young girl wandered through the house, exploring its many rooms. In the corner of the living room, she paused, tilting her head as if listening to something. A faint whisper echoed in her ear, "Welcome home." Years passed, and the legend of the house on Willow Lane faded into the background of small-town gossip. People eventually forgot the stories of missing families, strange noises, and unexplained disappearances. The house, however, sat quietly at the end of the street, untouched by time and suspicion. The new owners, Mark and Sarah, had no knowledge of the house's dark history. To them it was simply a dream home, an affordable, spacious property, perfect for raising their two children, Alex and Mia. From the moment they stepped inside, it felt like home. The creaks and groans of the old structure seemed like charming quirks to them, not harbingers of something sinister. At first, everything was perfect. The kids settled into their new rooms, Sarah started redecorating, and Mark tinkered with minor repairs. But as the weeks went on, little things began to happen, things they couldn't explain. Footsteps on the stairs when no one was there, doors that refused to stay shut. Strange drafts of cold air that swept through the house, no matter how many windows they checked. One night, as Sarah was putting Mia to bed, she heard it. A soft whisper, so faint she thought it was her imagination. "Mommy, who's that?" Mia asked, her eyes wide. "Who, honey?" Sarah replied, glancing around the room. "The lady in the corner," Mia said, pointing to the far side of the room. "She's watching us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. There was no one there. She quickly tucked Mia in and left the room, but as she closed the door behind her, she felt a cold chill sweep past her, like someone had just walked by. The next morning, Sarah mentioned the incident to Mark, who shrugged it off as a child's imagination. "Kids make things up all the time," he said, "especially in a new place." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She decided to investigate the house's history. What she found sent a wave of fear through her. Every family that had lived in the house had either disappeared or moved away under mysterious circumstances. The most recent family, a young couple with a daughter, had vanished without a trace. The house had been abandoned for years after that. Despite her growing unease, Sarah didn't say anything to Mark. She didn't want to alarm him or the children. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt amplified, every creak and groan seeming like a warning dot. At around 2 a.m., Sarah awoke to the sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. She nudged Mark awake, and they both listened. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Mark got up to check, but when he opened the door, there was nothing there, just the empty hallway, stretching into darkness. But as he stood there, something caught his eye. A figure, standing at the far end of the hall, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face pale, her hair hanging limp around her shoulders. She stared at them with hollow black eyes. Mark froze. "Sarah, do you see that?" But before Sarah could answer, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. Sarah and Mark knew now that something was terribly wrong. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding off their fear, growing stronger with every passing day. They began to experience more frequent encounters with the mysterious figure. It always appeared at night, watching from dark corners, lurking in the shadows, never speaking but always present. Sarah realized, with a sinking dread, that it had to be Claire, the woman who had sacrificed herself years ago to break the curse. But Claire wasn't the only spirit trapped in the house. One night, as Sarah wandered the house unable to sleep, she felt the temperature drop sharply. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. As she turned the corner into the living room, she saw them. Dozens of figures, their faces gaunt, their eyes empty. They stood silently, their bodies flickering like static in the dim light. At the center of them all was Claire. Her face twisted in sorrow. She raised her hand as if to warn Sarah. "Leave," Claire whispered. before it's too late. But Sarah couldn't leave, not without her family, and even if she tried, she knew the house wouldn't let her. The house was hungry, and it was growing impatient. The whispers became louder, the strange occurrences more violent. Alex and Mia started having nightmares, waking up screaming, claiming they'd seen the lady in their rooms. Mark, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize everything, but even he was starting to feel the weight of the house's dark presence. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, a loud crash echoed from the basement. They all jumped, staring at each other in shock. It sounded like something had broken, a door or a wall, maybe. Mark grabbed a flashlight and headed down to investigate, while Sarah stayed behind with the kids. In the basement, Mark found the source of the noise. The trapdoor, the same trapdoor that had haunted the house's previous owners, had been forced open. The staircase leading down into the earth was exposed, the air around it vibrating with an unnatural energy. He called Sarah down, and together they descended the steps, their hearts pounding. When they reached the bottom, the sight before them confirmed their worst fears. The underground chamber was still there, untouched by time. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, casting an eerie light on the walls. But now, there was something new. A dark, pulsating mass in the center of the room, throbbing with life. It was as if the house itself had a heartbeat, a living entity hungry for something more. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Mark nodded, his eyes wide. "It's alive." As they stood there, frozen in fear, Claire's figure appeared before them once again. This time her presence was more solid, more desperate. "You have to finish what I started," Claire said, her voice trembling. "It's not just me. It's the house. It feeds on fear, on life. It wants your family." Mark and Sarah exchanged horrified glances. The house had no intention of letting them go. It had consumed Claire, and now it wanted them too. But how? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "How do we stop it?" Claire's form flickered as she pointed to the book that still lay on the altar, the same one that had led her to her doom. "The ritual," she whispered. "You have to complete the ritual. You have to sacrifice the fear it feeds on." Mark stepped toward the book, but as he did, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The walls shook, and the dark mass in the center of the room pulsed faster, its hunger growing more urgent. They didn't have much time. As the walls closed in around them, Sarah grabbed the book, flipping through its ancient pages. The words seemed to twist and blur, but she understood the essence of what it demanded. To break the curse, they had to face their deepest fear. Not a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of the terror the house fed upon. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But we have to do this," Mark nodded, gripping her hand tightly. Together they stood before the altar, their hearts racing, the air around them growing colder with every breath. The mass in the center of the room began to writhe, sensing their fear, feeding on it. "We're not afraid of you," Sarah whispered, though her voice wavered with every word. "You can't have us." The moment those words left her lips, the house let out an unearthly howl. The ground beneath them shook violently, but the mass began to shrink, its form dissolving into the air. The symbols on the floor flickered and died, and the oppressive weight in the room lifted. For a moment, there was silence. Then Claire's voice filled the chamber one last time. "Thank you." With that, her figure faded, and the house finally went still. Peace at last. Months later, the house on Willow Lane stood empty once more. The town's residents whispered about the strange happenings, but no one dared go near it. For the first time in decades, the house was quiet. The spirits had been freed, the curse, broken Dot. But as Mark and Sarah drove away with their children, leaving the house behind for good, they couldn't help but feel a lingering presence, like a shadow, just out of sight. Dot some houses, after all, never truly let go.